Copyright notice. You are free to download and copy this work in audio format for replay in any audio or video mode, and I encourage you to do so and enjoy and learn. You may redistribute it in a non-commercial fashion, that is, not for profit directly or indirectly. You may not sell or seek to profit from this publication in part or in whole, nor may you translate it into any written format for any purpose. Thank you. Chapter 10 of the e-novel, survival novel, When the Walls Came Tumbling Down, as read by the author. The decision. Tom could hear the distinct whining noise of the Humvees, and the noise gave him confidence and hope. He stayed in the tree line and got out his binos. He could see the convoy of 6 vehicles moving, and it lifted his spirits. Perhaps things had gotten back to normal now. Something was being done. He wished he had tuned into the shortwave radio earlier, but that thought faded at the joy he felt now. Urging the horses into a trot, he headed to the road as the convoy crested the hill ahead. He would follow them, perhaps to some hot food, perhaps to a clean bed and a shower too. Spirits soaring, he spoke to the horses, urging them to hurry. He didn't want to go into a full lope. The pack animal couldn't handle that much without losing the gear. Several minutes later he caught up. Smelling the diesel first, he reached the crest of the hill and looked over. There, just a few hundred yards away, was the convoy, parked in a sort of arc around the farmhouse. There was a man and 2 women in the front yard. Tom was about to yell out, but something didn't look right about the scene at all. The soldier who was in charge was pointing a weapon at the man, but the man was clearly unarmed. Suddenly there was a flash from the end of the rifle, and the man fell just as the report of the round reached Tom. He couldn't believe what he had just seen. Murder! Quickly he turned the horses away from the crest, urging them down into the tree line, hoping they hadn't seen him yet. Dismounting in a swoop, hands shaking with fear as much as rage, he grabbed his rifle and ran near the crest and flopped down, crawling until he could see the convoy again. Now he could see clearly that the man who had done the shooting was dragging one of the women into the house, and his men were helping carry the other. Oh my God, was this really happening? His mind didn't register. He had been a soldier for decades himself, and while he knew that sometimes an individual soldier may do such a thing, not a whole patrol. Not a patrol this size especially. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be. The 6 vehicles all had machine guns, either M2s firing huge 50 caliber bullets the size of his thumb, or 240 Bravos firing the 7.62 NATO rounds. This was a tremendous amount of firepower alone. Each vehicle seemed to be fully crewed, and the crews were milling around, some of them smoking, but several others were headed inside, following the leader as he dragged the hysterical and frightened women by the back of their clothes into the house. Another man grabbed a woman's feet. He could not possibly fight this whole group. They would snuff him out in a second. He knew, though, that patrols often went within some proximity to one another. Perhaps another patrol was nearby. He looked around, hoping he would see evidence, perhaps a dust cloud or even the wisp of diesel, but he saw nothing. That these men were not following orders and had gone rogue was obvious. This was not how soldiers behaved. These men had gone off the reservation and probably would not even report having been here. Tom knew that the man's death would be reported as being done simply by marauders. The women, if they weren't murdered outright after the rapes, would be listened to not at all. These scum might come back and stop routinely here, in fact, just to make things even worse, even more horrible. However, there was one thing that would bring the other patrol here. If they were engaged, others would be sent. They would have to call it in. Anytime there was a tick or troops in contact, it went out on the net. Even if their leader wanted to keep this all quiet, somebody in the convoy would call it out of reflex from training, especially if they were under fire. Looking behind him, he realized that the copse of trees he was in was too small, that he could not hide in it, especially not with the horses. While the crest of the hill offered cover and concealment, that would disappear if the vehicles advanced on him. He might be able to make a run for it, but not with the pack animal. She was too slow. He cut her loose and swatted her, and she took off, but only for a short distance down the hill, then looked back at them both sadly. He would find her later, or she would find them. For a brief moment, Tom thought of just moving on. These things happened in life. It wasn't his business anyway. This was life, and it was tough. It was sad for the women, but what could he do? He was all alone. Her scream triggered something in him, though. His doubt faded in that instant. He knew he wasn't being rational, but he could not stop himself. He ran back to the top of the hill and got in a good prone position, pulling out an extra magazine for his AR and setting it on the dirt next to him. Quickly, drawing a bead on one of the men standing in the cluster by the door, he fired. He did not wait, but began firing as fast and as rapidly as he could into the crowd, noting that several of them fell as the rest ran into the house. Whether they fell from being hit or were just taking cover was not important. He was nearly half through the first magazine when the big M2 machine gun located his position and began raining its massively heavy projectiles on him. He continued to fire rapidly, now at the gunner. The other vehicles all too soon got into the fight. All hell was unleashed in him. This is what he wanted, though. He wanted the vehicles to engage. He wanted to make noise. Now it would surely be called in. Changing magazines, he slipped back down the hill. Confidence surged through him. They had been slow to react, not trained as a team, not yet gelled, the condition where a unit becomes a cohesive fighting force. Instead, they were still acting as a group of individuals. As a former soldier, he knew they would be disoriented for a moment, and he would take advantage of this. They continued to fire at his last position madly. He could hear confusion, orders yelled, and the sound of vehicles starting. They would advance on his position soon enough, but Tom hoped the other patrol would come. The women would live. There would be an investigation, and this rogue leader would surely fry. As Tom ran back to the horses, something slammed into his left leg, knocking him to the ground. In shock, he looked down at his leg, which was bleeding profusely, mangled. He did not want to see how bad it was, though. He knew. Dropping his rifle, he barely clambered up into the saddle, his left leg not working at all. It was his only chance, and he knew she was a fast horse. The pack horse was nowhere to be seen, but that was not important now. He needed only to get away. He had the other rifle in the scabbard, his pistol, and enough gear in the saddlebags. He could still make it. He just had to reach the tree line on the opposite side of the clearing. "Run, girl, get!" he yelled. The mare didn't need urging. She knew the man wanted to go, and she wanted to be gone also, to follow the other mare who had already run away. She took off like the wind, causing him to nearly fall from the saddle. He was going to make it. This one could move. He struggled to stay in the saddle, hanging on now, hand on the saddle horn, because he could not even feel his left leg, could not grip the horse with his legs. Ahead lay safety and freedom, that tree line. Soon, maybe any second now, the other patrol would come. They would give him first aid while they figured out what was happening. They would see he was former military. He would tell them what he had seen, and the rogue leader would hang. He would see to it. Murdering civilians is much worse than even killing a superior officer. This man would pay the price. He just had to get to the trees. Something slammed him in the back, knocking him from the saddle. He landed on the ground hard. He knew his back was broken from the fall. The .762 slug hitting him just above his heart. Looking up at the sky, choking for breath, he thought of a woman he once loved, his one true love. He thought of his mother who had died many years ago, of his children. All these thoughts as darkness closed in and took him. The road patrol never returned to the farm. The woman got a blanket and laid it over her husband, weeping but trying to be brave. Her daughter would now need her to be strong. The daughter lay weeping in the dirt next to her father, unconsolable in her despair. Neighbors appeared slowly and steadily over the hours, offering support with their presence, taking their dear friends in their arms. The men were buried side by side that day in the family graveyard where generations of the Lusk family had been laid before. They did not know this stranger's name. The murderers had looted and desecrated his body. Now, though, in the family plot lay too a stranger. A stranger, yes, but also a friend, as the neighbors reverently shoveled earth over the two bodies in the bottom of the freshly dug graves. An old veteran stood at attention and saluted the remains of that brave man, unknown to them but known to God. First Sergeant Tom Lazinski, U.S. Army retired, finally went home to rest. The women still remember him, though, and a young girl still puts flowers on the grave now and then. remembering him and thanking him. A rising tide. The snow would be gone soon, and the last of the maple syrup was being boiled down. We'd been very aggressive and had nearly 15 gallons of boiled down syrup. This, combined with a potential honey crop, would provide us enough for our own needs, and some to barter with as well. It seemed as if every tree in the area was tapped. Indeed, all had at least something hanging off of them to collect syrup in. Normally we used discarded and washed out milk jugs, something we used to see people throwing away, something also we may never see again. In times past, I used to put out 50 taps and had over 100 jugs. Each morning I would lug the sled to the top of the hill full of empties and swap them out for fulls, allowing gravity to help me get the full sled back to the sugar shack at the bottom of the hill. I wish I had more jugs for now. I was dumping these into 5-gallon buckets on the sled instead. Every 5-gallon bucket was in use, and I wished I had gotten hundreds more of them. They were probably the most useful device a homestead could have. Today, everybody had every container imaginable pressed into service and had made a number of homemade taps as well, from simple pieces of copper tube to hand-whittled hardwoods as our ancestors had done, and other clever devices. One fellow had tubes running into plastic taps. He simply let it all run down to his house and collected it automatically. The most creative sap collector bucket I saw was an old World War II steel helmet liner hung out by one of the neighbors. During our patrols, we would do atmospherics. Make sure everybody was okay, and also ask if they had things to barter or what they needed. I was trying to connect needs with those who had things. This would stimulate not only the economy, but also community ties and bonds. Several farms had grain and potatoes in their silos, sitting at the bottom or in hard-to-clean corners, which they were now using. Most of them were growing weary of only potatoes or wheat, though, and they often had several hundred bushels worth. In the past, it would not have been considered marketable, but now it was like gold, especially to hungry people. Everyone was hungry, and we prayed for a successful spring planting. Unfortunately, most people had no food to trade, although they had other items. Everyone was simply afraid to let go of what they had because they feared they would never have a chance to replenish it. Therefore, it took a lot of coaxing to get people to even consider turning loose. But eventually, if you had something somebody else wanted and vice versa, a trade could be done. Now, I had some gold, but I knew better than to pull this out right away. It would have so little value at the moment while people were still starving. One day it would have value, but while we were all just one step from starvation, the man with gold would take a beating because nobody really needed it now. The focus was on food. Those who might trade things like food for gold knew they could demand a hefty price for their food because they knew that you can't live without food, but you can live without gold. Several of our hens were broody, and Jacqueline marked a dozen fertilized eggs with a pencil for each one of them to sit on and hatch out. She marked nearly 60 total, from which I estimated about 50 would survive. I also knew most of these would be roosters. The plan was to get all the neighbors their own rooster and 3 hens to start. We would do these hatch outs throughout the year and probably give out maybe 5 or 6 of these flock starters each month. And, of course, be eating a lot of rooster ourselves. Jacqueline knew how to castrate roosters to make capon, a fattened-up rooster, essentially. Once you figured them out, chickens were easy, sort of like hogs. You could feed them anything, from grass clippings to eggs, although the latter wasn't advisable because it tended to make them peck at other eggs and learn to eat them. The thought of chicken cannibals made me shudder as I thought of the rumors Dave had reported in the Clarion. I wanted us to get some hogs and had a plan. Slow Eddie. Slow Eddie lived in the center of town and he had hogs, something that his neighbors had despised him for before the collapse. The odor of hog manure in the summer is a scent most human nostrils should never be forced to endure. I remember sitting in church one day with the windows open, a nice beautiful day, and being suddenly assaulted by the horrific odor of pig manure cooking in the sun. Now, however, we all envied him for it, while still hating the smell, of course. I had met Eddie one evening when walking back from a neighbor's house before the collapse. He was called Slow Eddie because he was a little mentally handicapped. Nobody meant anything by calling him Slow Eddie. He liked the name because it was true. To Slow Eddie, if you were something, then that's just the way it was. No sense whining about it and acting all offended, especially if somebody meant no offense. He was just as good as any man in the town, and he knew it. We all knew it, and that was that. We helped Eddie with being slow, and he helped us in return by tolerating our foolish ways. The way we would go the long way around the tree to get to the other side, so to speak. Because he sometimes didn't understand things like what was allowable and what you could and couldn't do, he just did things. As such, he kept hogs in the middle of town, something nobody did except, of course, Slow Eddie. When the police had come out to ask him why he was keeping hogs in the middle of town without proper silage runoff, without consideration for the smell, without even a permit, not that anyone had ever gotten one or needed one, Eddie had a simple explanation for it all. He liked pork chops, he exclaimed. Brilliant, eloquent, and to the point, if not entirely misunderstanding why nobody else could see the logic in it. He also did things other people didn't think of. He saw the world through a different prism, and it made him a fascinating character to deal with, albeit a little difficult to understand at times. He and I had struck a bargain for a sow that he would deliver to me, already bred by his wild boar, Max. Max was actually a pet, and he liked Eddie. Max also hated the rest of humanity with a passion and fury unknown in the civilized world in history, and I imagine in the not-so-civilized world as well. It was so funny to watch that old boar follow him around, making happy little grunting noises. Eddie didn't know you couldn't tame a wild boar. He didn't know they weren't supposed to make good pets. Neither did Max, the vicious snaggle-toothed tool of Satan that followed Eddie around sniffing the ground. Eddie would talk to Max, and Max would answer back. Max was as loyal and dedicated to protecting Eddie as any pack of attack-trained dogs in the world. I suspect Max would have followed Eddie to storm the gates of hell if Eddie decided one day that storming those gates was something that just needed doing. Change 17. The sniper had taken out a couple of his men. That didn't bother Ox so much. What did bother him, though, was what he had done before that. He knew now that shooting that angry old man was a bad idea, but his temper had just gotten the better of him. Had he planned it out right, he would have done it very different. He would have come back later with a smaller patrol comprised only of the dozen or so men that he could count on, the ones that would do anything he said, who understood the game. Today, though, he had made a serious error. He saw it in the men's faces, saw them huddling and looking suspiciously his way. These men were no longer with him. They probably never were. He would have to act quickly. Calling a halt, he had the platoon dismount and fall in formation and gave the command, "Stack horse!" This was a parade ground command, but the soldiers all knew it. Still, there was a moment of confusion as the men looked around at each other. Some starting to move, others not sure what was going on. "Damn it, I said stack horse!" the Ox bellowed. One soldier quickly moved, and the rest, like dominoes, followed. Still, he could see there was hesitation, and from one soldier, actual contempt. The men complied and fell back in at attention. "About pace!" the Ox bellowed. "Forward, march!" The Ox marched them 10 paces away from the stacked arms, halted them, faced them back toward him. "Stand at ease!" he barked crisply. In unison now, the men snapped to parade rest, head and eyes locking in on the Ox. The Ox was the only one who still had his weapon. It was loaded, too. He stood between the entire platoon and their weapons now as well. "Listen up, people," the Ox began. "The man was making a move for my weapon. I had to defend myself," the Ox lied. "When we get back to the rear, I want sworn statements from each of the squad leaders saying the same." Ox looked at the men's faces, especially the squad leaders, and saw trouble there. Staff Sergeant Phelps, his second squad leader, was looking at him with hot anger in his eyes. "You got something to say, Phelps?" Phelps was one of those oath keepers. Ox had heard of them and didn't like this one at all. This was Phelps' first patrol with the unit, and he fully intended to report this first sergeant to the chain of command, who would surely fry him. He also began to suspect this man may not be a first sergeant at all. He didn't seem to understand that things were real, First Sergeant did, but would need more proof on that. You didn't launch allegations without proof. Not in the military. It was considered dishonorable. Still, he would definitely report what he had seen today, and it was nothing short of murder. Phelps was going to keep his plan close hold. Only a fool announces his intention, beats his chest, and then wonders why he lost. Unfortunately, now he was on the spot and knew that if he kept his mouth shut, many of the junior soldiers would presume everything was okay. Like it or not, he had to make a stand. He had to live his values regardless of consequence. With all due respect, Phelps began, that was a clear violation of the rules of engagement, First Sergeant. The way he said First Sergeant cut into the ox because of the vaguely subtle sarcasm. Their eyes locked again, and in that instant, the ox knew he was exposed. His charade as First Sergeant was over. His free ride at the base ended. The die was cast. It was now time to act. Ox nodded for a second, got a grim look on his face, and said, "Well, Staff Sergeant, you were wrong, and I have witnesses to back me up." Several men who were with the ox, who liked the way he operated no matter what, nodded vigorously, and some voiced their approval. Nearly half did not, though. Some were, in fact, getting determined and angry looks in their eyes, too. This Phelps had ruined everything. "Platoon, attention!" "Ho!" Ox bellowed. "All those who agree that this was a justifiable shooting, one step forward, march!" Ox was deliberately using drill and ceremony to manipulate the soldiers on the one point he knew, that they were disciplined and would remember their discipline easier this way. He noted that Phelps was very slow to come to attention, though, and he definitely stood fast, did not move that crucial and defining step forward. "Those of you who took a step in the right direction, when I give you the command, will fall out and assemble behind me. The rest will stand fast," Ox explained, then ordered, "Fall out." The platoon was now nearly evenly divided, but it was definitely not a stalemate. The ox had his weapon, and behind him, the platoon's weapons, and his followers right behind that. Ox smirked at Phelps, whose face was now a crimson red. He wished he could shoot him right here on the spot, but that would only make things harder. Ox had won, though, again. Speaking to the men behind him, he said, "Those of you who are with me were still soldiers. Recover these weapons, arm yourselves, and cover down on the vehicles." Sergeant Shannon, an ignorant bully of a man who was his most senior and also most capable of enforcing discipline, he told Shannon to shift the men around to recrew all the vehicles. They would leave these men behind. "In war, mutiny and insubordination are punishable by death," the ox stated to the men still standing fast. "I could shoot you all right now. Instead, you will stand here at attention until I send the MPs back to arrest you and take you into custody." Ox lied. He had no intention, in fact, of returning to the base ever again. The soldiers stood fast as ordered. When the sound of the vehicles moved just beyond the crest of the hill, though, Staff Sergeant Phelps, oathkeeper, took charge. "Listen up, men, we need to move. Those guys just committed murder. That's a war crime against our own people." Phelps knew that if the murdered man had family or friends nearby, they might take revenge on these remaining soldiers, regardless that they were not in approval of the atrocity they had just seen. He also knew that the First Sergeant was a phony, but that was something the investigators would discover probably within a few hours of looking into the man's records. He also knew that the patrol might change their mind, might turn around and come back and just shoot them on sight. Phelps looked the men in the eye and then gave the command, "Follow me, men," and took off at a trot for the tree line. The men followed close behind him. They had all passed a test that day, had stood on their oath, and now there was a bond between them. Soldiers need a leader, and these men were glad they finally had one. Close call. There was no doctor to make a house call, but rumor had it there was one in Presque. Leroy Hathcock was dying now, and Liz knew it. This was her patient, and she was a nurse, and this made her a force to be reckoned with. She knew exactly what needed to be done and would not stop until it was done. She told Steve to get their Jeep, and when he started to protest about the fuel, he stopped because he saw that look in her eyes. She wasn't belligerent or contentious, far from it, but when she was in nurse mode, nobody dared get in the way. As gently as possible, they carried Leroy to the Jeep, careful to not open the wounds further. He looked like he was dead already, though, his skin color being almost gray now. Liz prayed that they were not too late. Dave had told her the address to the doctor in Presque, and she had found it on the map. Both got their weapons out now, donned body armor and helmets, and took off. "Steve, honey," Liz spoke sweetly, holding Leroy's hand, "don't spare the horses." Steve nodded and put the vehicle into gear, and at a fly they took off. The roads were nearly devoid of snow, but had some nasty ice patches. The snow tires would help, and with any luck, they would make it without getting ambushed, without getting shot, and without getting into a wreck. She had waited for Al to be gone and then told Jacqueline the plan. Al would be furious, of course, but A, he wasn't the boss, B, this wasn't her patient, C, it was better sometimes to ask forgiveness than permission, and D, he could refer to A and kiss her butt if he didn't like it. Now, though, she had a patient to tend to. Leroy smiled feebly from the back seat as Steve drove as fast as the conditions would allow, as much to get Leroy there before he died as to make them less a target. Clever. Linda was proving to be a bigger asset than David realized. At first, he was just being polite about wanting her to stay. Now, though, it was different. Sometimes people in desperate situations look at survival as a zero-sum game, that there are finite resources that will never replenish, and therefore each person who climbs into the boat makes it sink a little lower and a little faster. In reality, though, while some resources are finite, others replenish, and that takes manpower. A good plan always includes the option to put everyone to work producing needed resources. A bad plan has everyone simply sitting around and consuming them. Linda was definitely producing. He realized she was a godsend, that she would probably be the primary reason he made it, if indeed they did at all. She knew things. She had skill, all about things that he had never imagined. He was a little ashamed that he had discounted her because she was just a girl. He wasn't a bad man for thinking that. It's just the way he was raised. But he was learning fast. Today, Linda was out splitting wood. She was small, but very strong and fit. She and her departed husband had considered being healthy and exercising a necessary part of being prepared, and it was obvious by the strength and energy that she had. She also had spent some time splitting wood before as well. That much was obvious. She showed him a trick about it now. Using an old discarded car tire from inside the barn, she put this on top of a stump, then put a piece of wood to be split inside on its end. She was too tiny to use a full maul, but had instead sharpened his 3/4 axe, which she wielded with a skill that would have made any lumberjack green with envy. Moving rapidly in a circle, she split away at the wood, each blow efficiently cleaving off a piece of wood that remained inside the tire. In this fashion, she quickly rendered the large piece of wood into split sections perfect for the stove. The tire kept the wood from flying all over the yard and having to be retrieved after each swing of the axe. She had learned that trick and others on a place called YouTube, on the internet, from one of the many prepper channels there before the collapse. She didn't even remember which one. Dave heard of it, of course, this YouTube, but had no idea it was for more than just entertainment. Now, though, he was learning, albeit a little late, still not too late. Tracks. Greg and Brian pulled into the farmyard, and Brian was now yelling for help. Slowly, a couple of the group came out of the house as Brian pulled up and slumped over the handlebars of the snowmobile. A bit dramatic, but it got them to at least come out of the house and help him from inside. Greg put his snowmobile in the barn, then bypassed all the commotion in the kitchen and went to his room. Hands shaking, he got out a bottle and took himself a long drink. From the living room, he could hear Brian cry out in pain. He wondered how bad he was hit, how much of it was just show, just being an attention hound. He didn't like losing, didn't like being shot at, and didn't like being scared. All three had happened that morning. His rage built up slowly within him as he paced the floor. He would find that piece of garbage who had lured them into that trap and would burn him alive. He would tie him to a tree and pour diesel all around and listen to him scream as he slowly suffocated and roasted. The thought of the man's pain and suffering made Greg smile a bit, but only for an instant. His little Amish girl was of course hiding again, as usual. She tried to avoid him as much as possible, and he didn't blame her, but didn't like that either. He was tired of her, but they had failed to find another place to take over lately, and none of the last ones had any women around. Women that weren't old enough to be his mother, that is. "Get in here, girl," he bellowed, and she slowly came, trembling with fear. She didn't want to because she knew what he was going to do to her again. She came out of fear because she also knew how much worse it was when she had tried to run and tried to hide. It was a nightmare, and she realized now that it wasn't ever going to stop, that he would one day kill her. She shook violently, which only seemed to make him smile, to give him some sick satisfaction, and also made him even more aggressive. He beat her savagely. Her cries and whimpering reminded him that he wasn't weak and vulnerable, that he was strong and powerful, that he was in control still. He forced himself upon her savagely afterward. She knew better than to cry this time, though. He had taught her the consequences of that already. That day, what Greg failed to perceive, though, was the caliber of men who had ambushed him. They had rattled his cage enough to send him running for his hiding hole. It was a trick their leader had taught him, something he had learned in the jungles of Vietnam, fighting a more formidable foe named Victor Charles. You killed most and let a few get away, but you followed their blood trail back to the camp. The Fallen. The men followed the all-too-easy trail in the snow, an occasional spot of blood from the one that they had hit, but was still riding, although the tracks themselves were now all too easy to follow. Their quarry were trying to lose them, and apparently thought they had succeeded. They now seemed to head in a generally straight direction to the south as a result. Dirty Mike was leading the team that day, each man on an almost new stolen Yamaha snowmobile courtesy of the local dealership. They had simply ridden in with a large flatbed truck and had the shop owner load them at gunpoint, along with spare parts, snowmobile suits, jackets, and gear. The men were not novices at riding snowmobiles, though. Neither were the men they tracked. The 6 men, all identically armed and equipped with full-auto 7.62 battle rifles sporting ACOGs, had been working together for years in much more challenging missions than this. As 1%ers of the Fallen Motorcycle Club Maine chapter, they had been running meth and guns throughout the Northeast, much of it into Canada and Quebec. Their president, Danny Tobarez, ran the club with military precision. The meth business had all but dried up as the dynamics of the economy now meant money was no longer needed and nobody had anything worth trading for it. The club had simply switched its operations over, seeking new resources. The Fallen had officially found Greg and his little group. Their only escape now would be death, and the Fallen were experts at dealing it out.